Chapter 1. The Accusation. The great hall had never felt quite so vast, Harry thought as his name echoed off the stone walls. Professor McGonagall's voice carried across the sea of upturned faces with crisp authority. Potter. Harry. He could feel every pair of eyes in the hall tracking his movement from the huddle of first years toward the three-legged stool. The sorting hat sat atop it like a crumpled afterthought, its pointed tip drooping to one side, the tear that served as its mouth sealed shut in what might have been sleep. Harry's legs felt unsteady beneath him, not from fear of the sorting itself, though that was present too, but from the sheer overwhelming magnitude of finally being here, at Hogwarts, after 10 years of believing magic was nothing more than dangerous nonsense. The whispers started as he walked. He caught fragments floating on the air. "That's Harry Potter, and look at his scar, and can you believe he's so small?" Harry hunched his shoulders against the scrutiny, a familiar defensive posture learned from years of making himself invisible in school hallways when Dudley's gang was prowling. The irony wasn't lost on him that here, in the one place he'd hoped to blend in, he was more visible than ever. Professor McGonagall gestured for him to sit, her expression kind but formal. Harry lowered himself onto the stool, the wood warm against his legs, and looked up at the ancient hat. This close, he could see the intricate stitching along its edges, the way the fabric seemed to shimmer with something that might have been magic, or might have been age. The deputy headmistress lifted the hat with both hands, and for a moment it felt ceremonial, like something from the history books Mrs. Figg had smuggled him when the Dursleys weren't looking. The moment the sorting hat settled onto his head, everything changed. The sensation was immediate and invasive, like icy fingers rifling through his thoughts. Harry gasped, his hands instinctively reaching up to grip the edges of the stool as the hat's consciousness pressed against his own. But instead of the gentle probing he'd imagined, the presence in his mind recoiled with something that felt distinctly like shock, then outrage. The hat's voice, when it came, was not the whisper in his ear he'd expected. It boomed across the great hall with a clarity that made students jump in their seats and professors straighten at the high table. "I will not sort this child." Silence crashed over the hall like a physical weight. Harry's stomach lurched, confusion and mortification flooding through him in equal measure. Had he done something wrong? Was there something so fundamentally broken about him that even the sorting hat rejected him? Behind him, he could hear the rustle of robes as first years shifted nervously, and somewhere in the distance a spoon clattered against a plate. Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. "Hat, I'm afraid I don't understand." "I will not sort this child," the sorting hat repeated, its voice carrying an edge of something Harry had never heard before in an adult. Barely leashed fury. "Until answers are given for what has been done to him." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Harry felt the blood drain from his face. Somehow, impossibly, the hat knew. It knew about the cupboard and the bars on his windows, and the gnawing ache in his stomach that had been his constant companion for as long as he could remember. It knew about the bruises Uncle Vernon was so careful to place where they wouldn't show, and the way Aunt Petunia's voice could cut deeper than any physical blow. "Hat!" came a new voice, smooth and measured, from the direction of the high table. Dumbledore had risen from his ornate chair, his hands placed gently on the table before him. Even from this distance, Harry could see the headmaster's blue eyes, usually twinkling with what seemed like perpetual amusement, had gone very still. What perhaps we might continue this conversation in a more appropriate venue. "When?" The sorting hat's interruption was sharp enough to make several students flinch. When would have been appropriate, Albus? When he was 6 and eating scraps like an animal? When he was 8 and sleeping in a cupboard barely large enough for a grown man's shoes? When he was 10 and so malnourished that his ribs showed through his shirt? Harry's vision blurred at the edges. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in front of everyone. He tried to reach up and pull the hat off, but his hands wouldn't obey him. trembling uselessly in his lap. Around the hall, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from students, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward to catch every word. At the Gryffindor table, he glimpsed red hair. Ron, his face pale with shock. Or the boy's upbringing, while unfortunate, was necessary for his protection. Dumbledore began, his voice still carrying that infuriating calm. Protection. The Hat's voice dripped with disdain. Yes, let us speak of protection. Shall I tell them about the locks on his bedroom door, the bars on his windows, the way he learned to make himself so small and quiet that he might as well have been invisible, because invisibility was the only safety he knew? Professor McGonagall's face had gone white as parchment. "Albus," she said, and there was something in her voice that Harry had never heard from a teacher before, something that sounded almost like betrayal. "You said he was well cared for. You assured the entire staff. I had reliable reports," Dumbledore started. "But from whom?" The Sorting Hat's laugh was bitter and completely without humour. "From Mrs. Figg, who tried to tell you 3 separate times that the child was being starved and beaten? From the neighbours who called the police twice when they heard him screaming? Or perhaps from your own eyes, had you bothered to look?" Harry felt something inside him cracking open, a carefully constructed wall of normalizing and minimizing that he'd built around his childhood, beginning to crumble. The Hat wasn't finished. Through its voice, Harry could feel its consciousness pressing against his own, not invasive now but protective, wrapping around the wounded places in his mind like a shield. 10 years, the Sorting Hat said, and now its voice was quiet enough that the entire hall had to strain to hear it. 10 years of systematic cruelty, of deliberate starvation, of emotional abuse so constant and pervasive that this child learned to believe he deserved it. You placed him there, Albus Dumbledore. You knew what they were. The silence that followed was absolute. Harry could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on him like physical things. At the high table, Professor Snape was staring at Dumbledore with an expression Harry couldn't read, while Professor McGonagall looked as though someone had just told her everything she'd believed about the world was a lie. And Dumbledore's face had gone very, very still. "You knew," the Sorting Hat repeated, softer now but somehow more terrible for its quietness. "And you left him there anyway." Chapter 2. Memories Unveiled. The silence stretched on, or thick and suffocating, until Harry thought he might dissolve beneath the weight of it. He could feel the Sorting Hat's consciousness still pressed against his own, no longer invasive but oddly comforting, like a protective barrier between him and the hundreds of staring faces. The hat's fabric rustled slightly as it settled more firmly on his head, and when it spoke again, its voice carried a terrible kind of gentleness. "Perhaps," the Hat said, "it would be better to show them." Before Harry could ask what it meant, the world exploded into light and memory. Above the great hall, shimmering like heat waves in summer air, images began to form. Harry recognized them with a sick lurch of his stomach. These were his memories, pulled from the deepest recesses of his mind and projected for everyone to see. The first image was almost mundane. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old, standing on a chair to reach the kitchen sink, his thin arms straining to lift a plate nearly as large as his torso. "Harry's morning routine," the Sorting Hat said, conversationally, as though it were narrating a pleasant family film. "Age 4. Breakfast preparation for the Dursley family. Note the careful precision. A broken dish meant no food for the day." The memory shifted, and now they could see the same small boy opening a cupboard door from the inside, squinting against the sudden light. The space was impossibly cramped, barely large enough for the thin mattress and threadbare blanket crammed inside. Spiderwebs clung to the corners, and Harry could hear several first-year girls gasp in horror as they realized what they were seeing. "Not his bedroom," the Hat continued, its voice growing colder. "For 10 years, this cupboard under the stairs was where Harry Potter, The boy who lived, the child who saved our world, slept every night, when he wasn't locked inside for days at a time as punishment for accidental magic. Professor McGonagall made a sound that might have been a whimper. At the Ravenclaw table, a girl with bushy brown hair. Granger, Harry remembered dimly from the sorting queue, had pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Even the older students, the ones who had seemed so confident and sophisticated just moments ago, were staring at the projected memories with expressions of dawning horror. The images kept coming, relentless in their mundane cruelty. Harry at 6, or standing perfectly still in the garden while his cousin Dudley and his gang used him for target practice with muddy stones, Uncle Vernon watching from the kitchen window with approval. Harry at 7 collapsed on the kitchen floor after a particularly vicious beating, Vernon's massive hands still clenched into fists above him. The memory was silent, but Harry could almost hear the echo of his uncle's voice. Freaks deserve what they get. 10 years, the sorting hat repeated, and now its voice was growing louder, carrying easily to every corner of the hall. 10 years of this, and not one adult asked why Harry Potter was so small, so quiet, so grateful for the smallest kindness. Not one adult wondered why the most famous child in the wizarding world flinched when people moved too quickly near him. Harry wanted to disappear, or wanted to sink through the floor or run from the hall, but his body wouldn't obey him. The hat's presence in his mind was like an anchor, holding him steady even as his world crumbled around him. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, could hear the whispered conversation starting to ripple through the crowd, and the humiliation was so intense it made his chest tight with panic. At the high table, Dumbledore had risen to his feet again. His face was composed, but Harry could see tension in the line of his shoulders, in the way his knuckles had gone white where he gripped the back of his chair. "Sorting Hat," he said, and there was steel in his voice that Harry had never heard before. "This is neither the time nor the place for such." When was the time? What Albus? The hat's interruption was sharp enough to make several professors jump. When was it ever going to be the time? When he turned 18 and the damage was already done? When he graduated and could no longer be your perfectly controlled weapon? Or were you planning to take this secret to your grave? The projected memory shifted again, showing Harry at 9, methodically preparing an elaborate breakfast while the Dursleys slept. His movements were practiced, efficient, the result of years of experience. But Harry could see what others might miss, the way his hands shook from hunger, the dark circles under his eyes, the careful way he moved to avoid aggravating what were obviously painful injuries. "Look at him," the hat commanded, and there was something almost pleading in its voice now. "Look at this child and tell me this was necessary. Tell me this was protection." In the memory, Harry stumbled slightly, catching himself against the counter as a wave of dizziness swept over him. He stood there for a moment, breathing carefully, before continuing with his tasks. The image was devastating in its quiet desperation. Professor McGonagall's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Albus," she said, and the word was full of a betrayal so profound it seemed to echo in the stone walls. "You told us he was cherished. You said, you promised." "The blood protection required," Dumbledore began, but McGonagall cut him off with a gesture so sharp it might have been a curse. "Required what?" Her voice was rising, anger and horror warring in her tone. "Required that we abandon a child to systematic abuse. Required that we ignore our duty of care, our responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The memory above them shifted one final time, showing Harry at 10, lying in his cupboard with bars newly installed on the small window, his only source of light. His ribs were clearly visible through his thin pajamas, and there were finger-shaped bruises dark against his pale arms. He was staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of a child who had learned that hope was just another kind of cruelty. The image faded, leaving the great hall in a silence so complete that Harry could hear the flames crackling in the torches along the walls. He realized dimly that he was crying. When had that started? And that he wasn't the only one. Throughout the hall, students and faculty alike were wiping away tears, yet their faces stricken with a mixture of horror and shame. 10 years, the Sorting Hat said one final time, its voice now gentle but implacable. 10 years of evidence that any of you could have seen if you had bothered to look. 10 years of a child screaming silently for help, while the adults who should have protected him made excuses and looked away. Professor Snape was staring at Harry with an expression the boy couldn't identify, something raw and haunted flickering in his dark eyes. At the Gryffindor table, the red-haired boy, Ron, was looking between Harry and Dumbledore with a confusion that was painful to witness. Even the portraits lining the wall seemed to be leaning forward, their painted faces reflecting the shock and horror that filled the living occupants of the hall. "And you, Albus Dumbledore," the Hat continued, its attention turning fully to the headmaster. "You knew. You saw the reports. You ignored the warnings. You chose this child's suffering over every other possible option, and you called it love." Dumbledore's face had gone very pale, but his voice when he spoke was still controlled. "The sacrifices required for the greater good." "Whose good?" The Hat's voice cracked like a whip. "Whose good was served by breaking a child so thoroughly that he learned to accept cruelty as care? Whose good was served by ensuring that Harry Potter would be so desperate for affection that he would follow you anywhere, do anything you asked, die for you without question if necessary?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing, and Harry felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. Because he could see it now, I could understand what the Hat was suggesting, and the worst part was that it rang true. He would have followed Dumbledore anywhere, would have been grateful for any kindness from the man who had rescued him from Privet Drive. He had been perfectly shaped for gratitude, for unquestioning loyalty, for manipulation. "You groomed him," the Hat said simply, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "You groomed a traumatized child to be your willing sacrifice, and you told yourself it was love." Chapter 3. The defense crumbles. The accusation hung in the air between them like a curse, and Harry felt the weight of every eye in the great hall pressing down on him. He could see Dumbledore's face from where he sat, could watch the careful mask of grandfatherly concern finally beginning to crack around the edges. For the first time since Harry had met him, the great Albus Dumbledore looked genuinely rattled. "That is quite enough," Dumbledore said, and his voice carried the full authority of his position as Chief Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, and Headmaster of Hogwarts. The tone was designed to end conversations, to remind everyone present exactly who held the power in this room. "The Sorting Hat will cease this inappropriate display immediately, and no." The single word cut through Dumbledore's command like a blade through parchment. Harry felt the Sorting Hat settle more firmly on his head, its ancient consciousness wrapping around his own with protective determination. "No, Albus Dumbledore. For 10 years your word has been law. For 10 years you have made decisions about this child's life without his knowledge or consent. But I am older than you, older than this school, older than the very foundations upon which your authority rests, and I will not be silenced." A tremor ran through the hall, not of magic, but of something deeper, the fundamental shift that comes when unquestioned power meets immovable resistance. Harry could feel it in the way the students around him sat straighter, in the way Professor McGonagall's expression sharpened, in the way even the portraits seemed to lean closer to catch every word. Dumbledore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its commanding edge, replaced by the patient tone of a teacher explaining a complex lesson to a stubborn student. The blood protection that flows through Harry's veins, placed there by his mother's sacrifice, ought required specific conditions to maintain its potency. Lily Potter died to save her son, and that love, that willing sacrifice, created a charm of such power that required what? The Sorting Hat's interruption was sharp and immediate. Required his suffering, required his near starvation, required his broken ribs and his night terrors and the crushing certainty that he was worthless. Harry flinched at the clinical recitation of his injuries, but the hat's presence in his mind remained steady, unashamed. Around the hall, he could hear sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of robes as people turned to stare at him with new understanding. "The blood protection," Dumbledore continued, his voice growing more strained, "could only be sustained while Harry could call his mother's blood relations home. Petunia Dursley, as Lily's sister, was the key to— Yes, let us speak of keys," the hat said. And there was something almost conversational in its tone now, like a professor encouraging a student to continue with a flawed argument so that its weaknesses might be fully exposed. The blood of Lily Potter, freely given in sacrifice, created a protection that would shield Harry from those who meant him harm. A beautiful magic, profound in its simplicity. "Tell me, Albus, what part of that protection required that the child be locked in cupboards?" Dumbledore's mouth opened, then closed without sound. What part of Lily's loving sacrifice demanded that her son learn to make himself small and silent to avoid his relatives' wrath? What clause in the magic required that he be denied food, denied affection, denied the basic dignity that should be afforded to any child, magical or not? The headmaster's face had gone pale, but he rallied gamely. The protection required that Harry remain with his blood relatives until he came of age. Any interference with that arrangement might have what? The hat's voice was rising again, carrying easily to every corner of the hall. Might have required you to actually monitor the child's welfare? Might have forced you to ensure that the people charged with his care were actually capable of providing it? Might have meant taking responsibility for a decision you made without his knowledge or consent? Professor McGonagall stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor with a sound like a sob. "Albus," she said, and her voice was shaking with barely contained fury. "You assured me, you promised me, that you would watch over him. What you said he would be loved and cared for. You said, I said what was necessary to ensure. You lied." The words came from an unexpected source. Professor Snape, who had risen from his seat at the high table with an expression of something that might have been recognition. "You lied to all of us, just as you lied to me about Potter's protection, about the necessity of—" He stopped abruptly, his face closing off, but the damage was done. Even Snape, it seemed, had been deceived about something. The Sorting Hat's attention turned back to Dumbledore with laser focus. "Shall we discuss Mrs. Figg's reports, Albus? The concerned neighbour who tried 3 separate times to alert you to the child's condition? Or perhaps we might examine the medical records from Little Whinging General Hospital, where Harry was treated twice for injuries that the attending physician noted were consistent with systematic physical abuse." Harry's stomach dropped. He didn't remember being taken to a hospital. When had that happened? But even as he wondered, flashes of memory surfaced. Being 8 years old and barely conscious after Uncle Vernon had lost his temper more thoroughly than usual. Aunt Petunia's tight-lipped explanations to doctors about accidents and clumsiness. "You knew," the hat continued relentlessly. "You had reports, you had evidence, you had multiple opportunities to intervene, and you chose not to. Do you know why, Albus? Shall I tell them?" "The greater good required," Dumbledore began desperately. "The greater good required that Harry Potter grow up grateful," the hat said, and its voice was now filled with a contempt so profound that several students flinched away from the sound. "It required that he be so starved for affection, so desperate for belonging, that he would follow you anywhere without question. It required that he learn early that his comfort, his happiness, his very life was worth less than the abstract concept of duty." Around the hall, Harry could see students beginning to understand, their faces shifting from confusion to horror to a dawning recognition. At the Hufflepuff table, A boy with sandy hair was staring at Harry with eyes bright with unshed tears. Someone who understood, Harry realized with a sick lurch, what it meant to be unwanted in your own home. You needed him humble, the hat pressed on, and Harry could feel its ancient consciousness pressing against his own, to sharing its outrage, its protective fury. You needed him malleable. You needed him convinced that he was lucky to receive any kindness at all, that he should be grateful for whatever scraps of approval you chose to throw his way. "That is not—" Dumbledore started, but the hat was not finished. "You needed him willing to die for you without question, didn't you? And what better way to ensure that than to make certain he never learned to value his own life?" The silence that followed was deafening. Harry could hear his own breathing, could feel the weight of the hat on his head like an anchor keeping him grounded while his world tilted and shifted around him. Because it was true, wasn't it? He could see it now, could understand the shape of his own manipulation with crystalline clarity. He had been willing to die for people he barely knew, willing to sacrifice himself for the abstract concept of good, because he had never learned that his life had value beyond its utility to others. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley was staring between Harry and Dumbledore with an expression of growing understanding and horror. Near him, the bushy-haired girl, Hermione, was crying openly now, her analytical mind clearly putting together pieces that painted a picture too devastating to deny. "You could have monitored them," the hat said, and its voice was quieter now, but no less damning. "You could have checked on him regularly. You could have ensured that the people you placed him with were actually suitable guardians. You could have intervened the first time Mrs. Figg reported suspicious bruises, and the first time a neighbor called the police, the first time a teacher noticed that the famous Harry Potter was smaller and quieter than he should have been." Dumbledore's hands, Harry noticed, were trembling slightly where they gripped the back of his chair. You could have moved him to a family that would have loved him. The Longbottoms offered, as did the Bones family, as did a dozen others. You could have placed him with people who understood magic, who could have helped him understand his heritage without making him feel like a burden for existing. You could have given him a childhood. The headmaster's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "The protection would have held," the hat said with absolute certainty. Lily Potter's love was not contingent on her son's suffering. Her sacrifice was not made more powerful by his pain. The blood protection would have lasted regardless of whether Harry was loved or abused, cherished or neglected. You know this, Albus. You have always known this. And in that moment, looking at Dumbledore's face, at the guilt and shame finally visible behind his careful mask, Harry knew that the Sorting Hat was right. The blood protection had never required his abuse. It had never demanded his isolation, or his gratitude, or his willingness to die for people who had failed to protect him. It had only required that he live with his mother's blood. Everything else, every beating, every hungry night, every moment of crushing loneliness, had been a choice. Dumbledore's choice. "You needed him grateful, didn't you?" the hat asked one final time, and its voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass decades of watching children suffer for the mistakes of adults. Desperate for acceptance? Willing to do anything? Sacrifice anything? Be anything you needed him to be? Dumbledore said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Chapter 4. Witnesses, step forward. The great hall had fallen into a silence so profound that Harry could hear the distant sound of wind against the enchanted windows. Dumbledore stood frozen at the high table, his usual composure finally shattered beyond repair, while the weight of the Sorting Hat's accusations settled over the assembled crowd like a suffocating blanket. Harry felt the ancient consciousness in his mind shift, turning its attention away from the headmaster and toward the other adults who had failed him. "But you were not alone in this failure, were you, Albus?" the hat said, and its voice carried a terrible kind of sadness now. "Tell me, Rubeus Hagrid." keeper of keys and grounds, friend to all magical creatures, protector of the innocent. What did you see when you delivered Harry's Hogwarts letter? From his position near the great doors, Hagrid made a sound that might have been a sob. The half-giant's massive frame was shaking, his beetle-black eyes bright with tears that had already begun to spill down his cheeks. Students turned in their seats to stare at him, confusion clear on their young faces as they tried to understand why the gentle giant looked so stricken. Hagrid's voice cracked, and he had to try again. I saw the bars, didn't I? On his window. Saw the locks on his door from the outside. Saw how small he was. How frightened. His great hands clenched into fists at his sides. But Professor Dumbledore said, he said it was necessary, that the boy was protected, that I mustn't interfere. And you believed him, the Hat said, not unkindly. You saw the evidence of abuse with your own eyes, and you chose to trust authority over your own moral compass. Tell them about the fear, Rubeus. Tell them about the way Harry flinched when his uncle moved too quickly. Hagrid's sobs were clearly audible now, echoing off the stone walls. He was so grateful, the big man choked out. So grateful for a bit of kindness, for someone to tell him he wasn't a freak. And I thought that was just how he was, sweet and polite. Not because he'd been taught that he didn't deserve. He couldn't finish the sentence. At the Gryffindor table, and several students were crying openly now, Harry could see Ron Weasley's face, pale with horror and something that might have been guilt. The realization was spreading through the hall like a slow poison. How many people had seen signs and done nothing? The Hat's attention shifted again, and Harry felt its consciousness reaching out, touching memories and secrets that had been buried for years. Arthur Weasley, it said, and though the man himself was not present, his name carried weight in the hall. Deputy Head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. Tell me, what did those ministry files contain? The ones tracking Harry Potter's unusual number of medical visits to Muggle hospitals? The silence stretched taut as people processed this revelation. Medical visits, plural. Harry felt sick as he realized what that meant. That there had been other times, other injuries severe enough to require professional treatment, that he couldn't even remember through the haze of pain and fear. 2 separate reports, the Hat continued relentlessly. One when Harry was 6, treated for malnutrition and suspicious bruising. Another when he was 8, for a concussion, and what the attending physician noted as defensive wounds on the forearms, consistent with systematic physical abuse. Arthur Weasley filed both reports. He followed proper procedure. He sent them up the chain of command, where they disappeared into the office of one Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. Professor McGonagall had gone so pale that Harry worried she might faint. Arthur tried, she whispered, and her voice was full of a grief so profound it seemed to echo in the stone walls. He tried to help, and you buried it. You buried evidence of a child suffering to protect your precious plan. But the Hat was not finished with its catalogue of failures. Its attention turned to the portraits lining the walls, those painted figures of former headmasters and headmistresses who watched over Hogwarts with supposedly wise eyes. And what of you? It demanded of the portraits. You who claim to guide this school, to protect its traditions and its students? What did you tell Albus when he brought his plans to place Harry Potter with the Dursleys? The portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black, normally the most vocal of the painted headmasters, seemed to shrink back into his frame. It was Dilys Derwent who finally spoke, her usually stern expression heavy with shame. We warned him, she said quietly. Many of us did. The boy's placement was questionable. We advised monitoring, suggested alternatives. Some of us were quite vocal in our opposition. And when those warnings were ignored, the Hat pressed. We assumed Albus knew best, that his wisdom exceeded our own. Dilys's painted eyes were bright with what might have been tears. We failed in our duty to protect a child because we trusted in authority rather than our own moral judgment. From his frame near the window, the portrait of Armando Dippet nodded sadly. The boy could have been placed with any number of loving families. The Longbottoms offered, as did the Bones family. We told Albus this. We presented him with alternatives that would have preserved any magical protection while ensuring the child's welfare. He refused them all, another portrait added. Said the blood protection was paramount, that the boy's comfort was secondary to his safety. We should have pushed harder. Should have demanded oversight, insisted on monitoring. The living occupants of the hall were staring at the portraits with expressions ranging from horror to betrayal. These were the figures they looked to for wisdom, for guidance, and they had failed as completely as everyone else. But it was Professor Snape who spoke next, his voice low and filled with a self-loathing that made Harry's chest tight with unexpected sympathy. "I knew," Snape said, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "I saw the signs, the flinching, the gratitude for basic kindness, the way he made himself small to avoid notice. I recognized them because I had lived them myself." His black eyes were fixed on Harry with an intensity that was almost painful to meet. I knew what those signs meant, and I said nothing because my hatred for James Potter blinded me to his son's suffering. The admission hung in the air like a physical thing, and Harry felt something shift inside his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Snape had been a victim too, had recognized the patterns of abuse and chosen to ignore them out of petty spite and unresolved trauma. "How many of you knew?" the Hat asked, its voice now carrying to every corner of the hall. "How many of you saw the signs, suspected the truth, and chose silence over action? How many of you failed this child because it was easier to trust authority than to trust your own moral compass?" Throughout the hall, Harry could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Students who had noticed his too thin frame, his obvious gratitude for simple kindness, his careful way of moving through the world. Faculty members who had seen the signs but assumed someone else was handling it. Parents who had heard rumors but done nothing to investigate. At the Hufflepuff table, an older student, a 6th or 7th year, stood up slowly. His face was flushed with shame, but his voice carried clearly through the hall. "I saw him in Diagon Alley," he said. "2 years ago, when I was shopping for school supplies with my parents. He was so thin, and his clothes were so large, and the people with him, they were cruel to him. I called him names, threatened him. I told my mother what I'd seen." The student's mother, sitting in the section reserved for parents, had tears streaming down her face. "I wrote to Professor Dumbledore," she whispered. "I described what my son had witnessed, expressed my concerns. I received a polite letter back, assuring me that Harry Potter was well cared for, and that my concerns, while appreciated, were unfounded." "How many letters were there, Albus?" the Hat asked, turning its attention back to Dumbledore. "How many concerned citizens, worried teachers, observant parents tried to tell you that something was wrong? How many reports did you ignore? How many offers of help did you refuse? How many opportunities for intervention did you dismiss?" Dumbledore remained silent, his face a mask of defeat and shame. A first-year girl at the Ravenclaw table raised her hand tentatively. When the Hat's attention turned to her, she spoke in a small, clear voice. "My aunt teaches at Harry's primary school. She said they were worried about him, that he was always hungry, always tired, that he flinched when adults moved too quickly. But when they tried to investigate, someone from the government told them to stop asking questions." The implications of that statement rippled through the hall like a shockwave. Government intervention to prevent investigation into child abuse, the systematic silencing of potential whistleblowers. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. "An entire community," the Hat said, and its voice was filled with a grief so profound that Harry felt tears sliding down his cheeks. that an entire community failed one child because they trusted authority more than they trusted their own eyes, their own hearts, their own moral judgment. Teachers who saw the signs but assumed someone else would act. Neighbors who heard the screams but convinced themselves it wasn't their business. Officials who received reports but filed them away and forgot. Friends who noticed the fear but told themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of muffled sobs from throughout the hall. Harry could see the weight of collective guilt settling over the assembled crowd, the dawning realization of how many people had contributed to his suffering through their inaction. "This is what complicity looks like," the Hat said quietly. "Not malice, but convenience. Not cruelty, but cowardice. Not evil, but the simple human failing of choosing comfort over courage, authority over conscience, silence over truth." And in that moment, Harry understood that his abuse had been enabled not just by Dumbledore's manipulation, but by an entire system of people who had chosen to look away when looking might have required them to act. Chapter 5. The Greater Manipulation. The weight of collective shame pressed down on the great hall like a physical thing, but Harry could feel the Sorting Hat's consciousness shifting again in his mind, preparing for what might be its most devastating revelation yet. The ancient artifact's attention turned back to Dumbledore, who stood frozen at the high table like a man facing his own execution. "But we have only begun to scratch the surface of your crimes, haven't we? Or Albus," the Hat said, and its voice carried a cold fury that made several students shrink back in their seats. "Shall we discuss the true scope of your manipulation? Shall we examine exactly how thoroughly you orchestrated this child's suffering?" Harry felt a chill run down his spine as the Hat's consciousness pressed deeper into his memories. Not the recent painful ones it had already shared, but older, more subtle manipulations that he had never recognized for what they were. "You did not simply place Harry with the Dursleys and hope for the best," the Hat continued, its voice growing stronger, more accusatory. "You orchestrated his isolation. You planned his suffering. You crafted every element of his childhood to serve your purposes." Dumbledore's hands were gripping the back of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, but he said nothing. What could he say? Harry could see the truth written in every line of the headmaster's face. "Tell them about the adoption requests, Albus," the Hat demanded. "Tell them about the dozens of loving families who begged to take Harry in after his parents' death. The Longbottoms, who had just lost their own son's future to Bellatrix Lestrange's torture, and wanted to honor Lily and James by raising their child as their own. Augusta Longbottom wrote to you personally, didn't she? Offered to provide Harry with everything he would need: love, protection, understanding of his heritage." Harry's breath caught in his throat. The Longbottoms had wanted him? Art Neville's grandmother, that formidable woman who had raised her grandson with such fierce protectiveness, had offered to do the same for Harry. "And Amelia Bones," the Hat continued relentlessly, "head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a woman of impeccable character and unquestionable loyalty to the light. She offered to adopt Harry, to raise him in a home where he would be loved and valued, where he would grow up understanding both his magical heritage and his parents' sacrifice." At the Hufflepuff table, a girl with reddish hair, Susan Bones, Harry realized, was staring at him with tears streaming down her face. Her aunt had wanted to take him in, had offered him a family, and Dumbledore had refused. "How many families, Albus?" the Hat pressed. "How many good, loving, our magical families offered to give Harry Potter the childhood he deserved? 12? 2 dozen? And what did you tell them all?" Dumbledore's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "The blood protection was never threatened by any of those placements," the Hat cut him off sharply. "The protection lay in Lily's sacrifice, in the love she gave her life to preserve. It could have been maintained through any number of arrangements: monitored visits to his aunt, annual stays at Privet Drive, even simple blood wards that required only occasional renewal. You know this, Albus. You have always known this. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as the implications sank in. All those years of hunger, of beatings, of sleeping in a cupboard, none of it had been necessary. If there had been families who wanted him, who would have loved him, and Dumbledore had turned them all away. But that would have interfered with your plans, wouldn't it? The Hat continued, and its voice was growing softer now, more dangerous. A Harry Potter raised by the Longbottoms would have been confident, proud of his heritage, secure in his place in the magical world. A Harry Potter raised by Amelia Bones would have understood law and justice, would have known his rights, would never have accepted abuse as normal. Harry felt sick as he began to understand. Every aspect of his misery had been calculated, designed to shape him into exactly what Dumbledore needed. You needed him broken, the Hat said, and the words fell into the silence like hammer blows. You needed him grateful for scraps, desperate for approval, but willing to sacrifice himself without question. You needed a weapon, not a child, and so you crafted one. Professor McGonagall made a sound like a wounded animal. Albus, she whispered, and her voice was full of a betrayal so profound it seemed to echo off the stone walls. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you couldn't have. But Dumbledore remained silent, his face a mask of defeat and shame. Oh, but we're not finished, the Hat said, and Harry could feel its ancient consciousness radiating outrage. Tell them about the monitoring, Albus. Tell them how you watched Harry suffer for 10 years and called it necessary. The Hat's attention turned to encompass the entire hall. Mrs. Figg was not simply a neighbour who happened to watch Harry occasionally. She was Dumbledore's agent, placed specifically to monitor the boy's situation. She reported directly to him every beating, every hungry night, every moment of cruelty. And what did you do with those reports, Albus? Dumbledore's silence was answer enough. You filed them away, the Hat continued, its voice growing colder. You read them. You understood exactly what was happening to that child, and you decided it was acceptable. More than acceptable, necessary. You watched him suffer and called it protection. You watched him starve and called it love. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley looked like he was going to be sick. Near him, Hermione Granger was crying openly, her analytical mind clearly putting together the horrifying scope of the manipulation. But perhaps the most insidious manipulation of all, the Hat said, and now its voice carried a note of disgust that made Harry's skin crawl, was how you orchestrated his rescue. Tell them about Hagrid's mission, Albus. Tell them how carefully you planned Harry's introduction to the magical world. Harry felt the memories shifting in his mind, and suddenly he could see his first meeting with Hagrid in a completely different light. The gentle giant's shock at Harry's ignorance about his own fame, his horror at the Dursleys' treatment, all of it had been theatre, hadn't it? Calculated to maximize Harry's gratitude and wonder. You sent Hagrid to collect Harry personally, not because it was necessary, but because you knew the impact it would have, the Hat revealed. A rescue by the most gentle, caring person at Hogwarts. A man who would show Harry kindness after years of cruelty, who would introduce him to wonder after a lifetime of mundane misery. You orchestrated that first taste of acceptance, that first moment of belonging, to ensure maximum psychological impact. Harry's chest felt tight as he remembered his overwhelming gratitude to Hagrid, his desperate desire to never disappoint the man who had shown him such kindness. It had all been planned. His rescue, his introduction to magic, even his first positive relationship, all of it designed to make him dependent on Dumbledore's world. You crafted a perfect victim, the Hat said, and its voice was filled with a contempt so profound that several people flinched away from the sound. A child so damaged by abuse that he would be pathetically grateful for any kindness. A boy so isolated from his heritage that he would trust whatever you told him about his place in the world. A weapon so perfectly forged that he would throw himself into any danger you pointed him toward, because he had never learned to value his own life above the approval of authority figures. Throughout the hall, gasps and sobs were clearly audible. Parents were clutching their children closer. Teachers were staring at Dumbledore with expressions of horror and betrayal. Even the portraits on the wall seemed to be recoiling from the magnitude of the manipulation being revealed. "You groomed him for sacrifice, didn't you?" the Hat asked, and its voice was quiet now, but somehow more terrible for its restraint. Every beating he received taught him that his pain didn't matter. At every hungry night showed him that his needs were secondary to others' convenience. Every moment of isolation reinforced that his value lay not in who he was, but in what he could do for others. Harry felt tears streaming down his face as the truth hit him like a physical blow. He could see it all now, could understand the shape of his own manipulation with crystalline clarity. Every aspect of his childhood had been designed to break him down and build him back up as Dumbledore's perfect soldier. "A child raised with love would have questioned your orders," the Hat continued relentlessly. "A boy who understood his own worth would have demanded explanations, insisted on agency in his own fate. But a victim of systematic abuse? A child who had learned that his survival depended on pleasing authority figures? He would follow you anywhere, do anything you asked, die for you without hesitation, if you presented it as necessary." The accusation hung in the air like a curse, and Harry could see the truth of it reflected in the horrified faces around him. He had been shaped, molded, crafted into exactly what Dumbledore needed. Not a hero, but a weapon. Not a savior, but a sacrifice. 10 years, the Hat said one final time, its voice heavy with grief and rage. 10 years of systematic psychological conditioning disguised as protection. 10 years of deliberate trauma presented as necessity. 10 years of breaking a child's spirit so thoroughly that he would never question the hand that wielded him. And in the terrible silence that followed, Harry finally understood the full scope of what had been done to him. He had not been saved from the Dursleys. He had been placed with them deliberately, monitored constantly, and rescued at precisely the moment that would maximize his dependence on his rescuer. He had been groomed, shaped, forged into a weapon, and the man responsible sat not 20 feet away, finally revealed for what he truly was. Chapter 6. The Students React. The silence that followed the Sorting Hat's final accusation was so complete that Harry could hear the distant sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Around him, hundreds of students sat frozen in their seats, their young minds struggling to process revelations that had shattered everything they thought they knew about the adults they trusted, the school they revered, and the hero they had been taught to admire. It was Hermione Granger who broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet with the sharp precision of analytical thought. "The ethical violations alone," she said, her bushy hair trembling as she struggled to keep her voice steady, "constitute multiple crimes under both wizarding and Muggle law. Negligent endangerment, child abuse by proxy, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to—" Her voice cracked, and she had to take a shaking breath before continuing. How many laws were broken to keep Harry in that place? How many people were silenced or threatened? How many reports were buried? Her words seemed to unlock something in the hall, and suddenly students were speaking, whispering, crying out in horror and confusion. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley was staring at his hands with an expression of sick understanding. "My dad," he whispered, and his voice carried in the sudden stillness. "My dad filed those reports. He tried to help. And Dumbledore, Professor Dumbledore." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't reconcile the man his family had trusted implicitly with the monster being revealed before them. "We invited Harry to the Burrow this summer. Mum was so happy, said she'd finally get to meet him properly, and all this time. His voice broke completely. Near him, Neville Longbottom was crying silently, tears streaming down his round face as the implications of what he'd heard settled over him. "It could have been me," he whispered, and the words carried a weight that made several nearby students flinch. "If I'd been the boy who lived instead of Harry, I could have been. My Gran offered to take Harry. She wanted to give him what she gave me: love, protection, a family, and Professor Dumbledore said no. The revelation that hit different houses in different ways, but none were immune to the horror of it." At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy sat rigid in his seat, his usually pale face somehow even whiter than normal. Harry could see the conflict warring in the other boy's expression. Everything his father had taught him about blood status and family honor crashing against the stark reality of institutional betrayal. "Even my father wouldn't," Draco started, then stopped abruptly. The implication hung in the air. Even Lucius Malfoy, for all his faults, wouldn't have orchestrated the systematic abuse of a child, or the boy who had been raised to believe in the superiority of purebloods over muggle-born wizards was confronting the fact that the supposed champion of the light had committed acts that would make even Death Eaters recoil in horror. From the Ravenclaw table, an older student, a 7th year with the bronze and blue tie of a prefect, stood slowly. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful and controlled, but Harry could hear the anger simmering beneath. "We trusted him," she said simply. "All of us. We looked up to him, followed his guidance, believed in his wisdom. He was supposed to be the greatest wizard of our time, the defender of everything good and right in our world." Her voice grew stronger, more accusatory, and he spent 10 years torturing a child to make him easier to manipulate. Her words opened the floodgates, and students from every house began sharing their own experiences, their own moments of doubt that they had dismissed out of respect for authority. A Hufflepuff 4th year stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "Last year, I tried to report a student who was being hurt by his family. The staff brushed me off, said I was probably misunderstanding the situation, that they knew better than I did. I thought I was wrong to question them." He looked directly at Harry, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I should have pushed harder." "My cousin," called out a Ravenclaw 6th year. "She's a squib, and her magical parents treat her like dirt. I told Professor McGonagall about it 2 years ago, and she said family matters were complicated, that I couldn't understand the full situation. I believed her." The girl's voice was thick with self-recrimination. "How many other kids are suffering while we tell ourselves that adults know better?" The Sorting Hat's voice, when it came again, was gentler now, addressing the students with something that might have been compassion. "Do not blame yourselves for trusting," it said. "Children are supposed to be able to trust the adults charged with their protection. You are not responsible for the failures of those who held power over you." But its voice grew stronger, more insistent. "However, you are responsible for what you do now. Now that you know how authority can fail, how good intentions can mask terrible cruelty, how hero worship can blind people to obvious suffering, what will you do with that knowledge?" At the Gryffindor table, a 7th year with the scarlet and gold badge of head girl stood up. Her face was flushed with anger and determination. "We demand immediate reforms," she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Child protection protocols that can't be overridden by any single person, no matter how powerful. Mandatory reporting requirements that go beyond the school hierarchy. Independent oversight of student welfare. Student representation in disciplinary decisions," added the head boy from Hufflepuff, standing to join her. "No more decisions about our welfare made without our voices being heard." Students throughout the hall were nodding, standing, adding their voices to the growing chorus of demands for change. Harry felt overwhelmed by the sudden solidarity, of the way his classmates were rallying not just to his defense, but to systemic reform that would protect others. A small voice from the 1st year section cut through the growing noise. It was Neville again, speaking with a quiet determination that seemed to surprise even himself. "We need to learn to recognize the signs," he said. "All of us. We need to know what abuse looks like, so we can spot it when adults fail to act. And we need to know we can speak up," added Hermione, her analytical mind already working through practical solutions. "We need systems that protect whistleblowers, that take student reports seriously, that don't allow authority figures to silence uncomfortable truths." At the Slytherin table, Draco stood slowly. His voice was strained, but determined. "My father always said that power justified anything, that the strong had the right to control the weak." He looked directly at Harry, and something in his expression was almost apologetic. "Maybe it's time to question what our parents taught us about authority, about who deserves to be believed." The comment sparked a wave of discussion throughout the hall. Students were questioning everything: their house loyalties, their family teachings, their assumptions about who could be trusted with power. Harry could see the fundamental shift happening in real time, a generation of young witches and wizards confronting the failure of the institutions they had been raised to respect. "Look around you," the Sorting Hat commanded, and its voice carried to every corner of the hall. "Look at what happens when good people choose silence over courage, convenience over conscience. Look at what happens when hero worship replaces critical thinking, when authority is trusted blindly instead of earned constantly." Students were looking, really looking, at each other, at their teachers, at the portraits on the walls, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The comfortable certainties of childhood were cracking, being replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more honest. "This is what growing up looks like," the Hat continued, its ancient voice filled with something that might have been pride. "Not accepting that adults always know better, but learning to think critically about power and its uses. Not trusting blindly, but demanding accountability. Not following orders without question, but insisting on explanations, on transparency, on the right to dissent." A Ravenclaw fifth year stood up, her voice clear and strong. "We pledge to support Harry," she declared, "and we pledge to support each other. No more looking the other way when someone is hurting. No more trusting authority figures just because they tell us to." The declaration sparked a chain reaction throughout the hall. Students from every house were standing, voicing their support for Harry and their commitment to change. Prefects were organizing committees, older students were volunteering to mentor younger ones, and throughout it all Harry could feel the weight of genuine solidarity. Not the hero worship he had always feared, but real friendship based on shared values and mutual protection. "This is what Dumbledore feared most," the Hat observed quietly. "Students who think for themselves. Young people who refuse to accept that suffering is necessary, that abuse is justified by noble goals, that children should be sacrificed for abstract concepts of good. You are becoming exactly what he tried to prevent, a generation that will hold authority accountable." Harry felt tears streaming down his face, but for the first time since this nightmare began, they weren't entirely born of pain. His classmates, these young people he barely knew, were standing up not just for him, but for the principle that what had been done to him should never happen to anyone else. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter felt truly protected, not by powerful adults making decisions for him, but by his peers choosing to stand with him, not through manipulation or control, but through genuine solidarity and shared commitment to justice. The students of Hogwarts were growing up, and they were doing it together. Chapter 7. Faculty Fractures. The solidarity of the students seemed to break something fundamental in the adults watching from the high table. As hundreds of young voices pledged support and demanded change, the Hogwarts faculty sat frozen in their ornate chairs, confronted with the magnitude of their own failures. Harry could see the exact moment when each professor began to understand their role in the system that had failed him so completely. Professor McGonagall was the first to crack. The usually composed deputy headmistress rose from her seat with trembling hands, her face a mask of anguish that made several students gasp in sympathy. When she spoke, her voice was raw with a grief that seemed to echo from the depths of her soul. "I failed you," she said, and though her words were directed at Harry, what they carried to every corner of the hall. "I failed in the most fundamental duty of any teacher, to protect the children in my care. Albus told me you were well cared for, that you would be loved and cherished by your aunt, and I—" Her voice broke completely. "I never checked. In 10 years, I never once visited to see for myself. I trusted his word over my own responsibility to ensure your welfare." Tears were streaming down the stern professor's face now, years of carefully maintained composure crumbling under the weight of her own complicity. "I saw you on that first day, saw how small you were, how grateful for the smallest kindness, and I told myself it was simply good manners. I never questioned why the famous Harry Potter seemed so surprised by his own fame, no so overwhelmed by basic courtesy." From his seat at the far end of the high table, Professor Flitwick's small voice carried with surprising clarity. "I suspected," he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. "There were signs, the way you flinched when voices were raised, how you always seemed hungry, the careful way you moved as though trying not to draw attention. But Dumbledore's reputation was so sterling, his wisdom so renowned, that I convinced myself I was seeing patterns where none existed." The tiny charm's professor's voice grew stronger, more self-condemning. "I chose convenience over conscience. It was easier to trust in authority than to confront the possibility that our greatest leader had orchestrated a child's suffering. I am ashamed of my cowardice." Professor Sprout stood next, her usually warm demeanor replaced by something harder, more determined. "There have been others," she said, and her words sent a chill through the assembled crowd. "Other students over the years who showed signs of abuse, of neglect, of trauma. Students I wanted to help, to protect, to remove from dangerous situations. But every time I brought my concerns to Dumbledore, I was told that family matters were complex, that I couldn't understand the full situation, that intervention might do more harm than good." Her voice grew bitter, filled with years of frustration and suppressed guilt. "I was told that my duty was to teach herbology, not to play at being a social worker. That there were protocols in place, systems beyond my understanding, that Dumbledore himself was monitoring these situations. I trusted him. I let myself be silenced, and children suffered for my compliance." The Sorting Hat's voice, when it came, was gentle but implacable. "Tell them about the protocols, Pomona. Tell them about Hogwarts' child protection policies." Professor Sprout's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "What policies? There are none. No mandatory reporting requirements. No oversight of student welfare beyond basic medical care. No systems in place to identify or address abuse. We have detailed procedures for handling dangerous magical creatures, specific protocols for containment of dark artifacts, elaborate safeguards for Quidditch matches." Her voice grew stronger, more angry. "But for protecting children from harm? Nothing. Because Dumbledore preferred to handle such matters personally, case by case, or with no transparency or accountability." From the far end of the table, Madame Pomfrey stood slowly, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. The school nurse's face was pale but determined as she addressed the Hat directly. "You want to know what 10 years of systematic abuse looks like? I can tell you. Malnutrition severe enough to affect growth and development, evidence of repeated physical trauma, healed fractures that were never properly treated, scar tissue consistent with burning, fading marks that suggest systematic striking." She turned to look directly at Harry, her voice filled with professional compassion and personal rage. "I could document every injury that child has sustained, every sign of neglect and abuse, if anyone had bothered to bring him to me for examination. But no one did, because no one wanted to see what was obvious to anyone with medical training. Professor Snape's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but carried clearly in the hushed hall. "I knew what those signs meant," he said, and there was a rawness in his tone that Harry had never heard before. "I recognized them because I had lived them myself. The hypervigilance, the learned helplessness, the desperate gratitude for any scrap of kindness. I saw my own childhood reflected in Potter's behavior, and I—" He stopped abruptly, his face closing off. But the damage was done. The revelation that the feared potions master had also suffered abuse sent ripples of shock and sympathy through the student body. Several Slytherins were staring at their head of house with expressions of dawning understanding. "You let your own trauma blind you to his suffering," the Sorting Hat said, not unkindly. "You chose old resentments over present duty, personal grievance over professional responsibility. You failed him as surely as any of them." Snape's nod was barely perceptible, but his voice when he spoke again was clearer. "I failed him. I failed in my duty as a teacher, as someone who had survived what he was enduring, as a human being with the power to intervene. I let my hatred for his father justify my abandonment of his son." The admissions were coming faster now, as if a dam had burst and years of suppressed guilt were pouring forth. Professor Flitwick spoke of dismissing signs of abuse in other students as mere difficult home situations. Professor Vector admitted to ignoring her concerns about several students because Dumbledore had assured her he was handling the situation personally. Even younger faculty members confessed to their failures. Professor Sinistra revealed that she had questioned some of Dumbledore's policies regarding student welfare, only to be told that her youth and inexperience made her unqualified to judge such complex matters. Professor Babbling spoke of concerns she had raised about institutional oversight that were dismissed as naive idealism. The pattern was clear. Dumbledore had systematically silenced, dismissed, or redirected any faculty member who questioned his methods or raised concerns about student welfare. He had created a system where his word was law, where questioning his judgment was seen as disloyalty or incompetence. "This ends now," Professor McGonagall declared, her voice stronger than it had been since the revelations began. "Whatever Dumbledore's position, whatever authority he claims, this culture of unquestioned obedience ends tonight. We will implement immediate reforms, mandatory reporting protocols that bypass administrative authority, independent oversight of student welfare, regular training on recognizing and addressing abuse. Student advocates," added Professor Sprout, her voice growing more determined with each word. "Students need adults they can trust who aren't part of the administrative hierarchy, people who will put their welfare above institutional loyalty." Professor Flitwick was nodding enthusiastically, his earlier shame being channeled into constructive action. Anonymous reporting systems, regular welfare checks, policies that prioritize student safety over school reputation or administrative convenience. "Medical autonomy," Madam Pumphrey declared. "Students need the right to request confidential medical examinations, to discuss their situations without fear of that information being used against them or suppressed for institutional purposes." The Sorting Hat's voice carried a note of approval. "This is what accountability looks like. Not punishment for past failures, but commitment to prevent future ones. Not comfortable blame shifting, but uncomfortable systemic change." Professor McGonagall stood straighter, her transformation from complicit authority figure to protective advocate visible in her posture. "Not, I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Albus Dumbledore's leadership of this institution. Whatever his past achievements, whatever his reputation, he has proven himself unfit to hold authority over children." A murmur ran through the faculty section of the high table. Several professors nodded immediately, while others looked conflicted. The weight of challenging such an iconic figure was enormous, but the evidence of his failures was undeniable. All in favor of removing Albus Dumbledore from his position as headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry? McGonagall's voice carried the formal authority of parliamentary procedure. Slowly, carefully, but with growing conviction, hands began to rise. Professor Sprout first, then Flitwick, then Pomfrey. Snape's hand rose after a long moment, and followed by the younger faculty members who had been silenced for too long. Even some of the more traditional professors, those who had served under Dumbledore for decades, reluctantly raised their hands as the magnitude of the institutional failure became undeniable. When the count was finished, the result was overwhelming. Only a handful of faculty members, those too shocked or too loyal to act, had abstained. None had voted against the motion. "Motion carried," McGonagall announced, her voice steady despite the tears still visible on her cheeks. "Albus Dumbledore is hereby removed from his position as headmaster, effective immediately. I assume interim leadership of this institution until proper procedures can be followed to select a permanent replacement." The silence that followed was profound. Dumbledore, who had stood frozen throughout the vote, seemed to age a decade in a matter of moments. The man who had been the most powerful wizard in Britain just hours ago now stood isolated, his authority stripped away by the very people he had commanded. "The healing begins now," McGonagall declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "For Harry, for this institution, for every child, we have failed. We will build something better, something that puts student welfare above administrative convenience, transparency above institutional loyalty, accountability above comfortable silence." And in that moment, watching the faculty finally accept their responsibility and commit to real change, Harry felt something he had never experienced before. The certainty that adults could be trusted to prioritize his welfare above their own comfort, or the revolution had begun. Chapter 8. The Wider Wizarding World. The removal of Dumbledore from his position as headmaster sent shockwaves through the great hall that seemed to ripple outward beyond the stone walls of the castle itself. Harry could feel the change in the air, not just the immediate transformation within Hogwarts, but something larger, as if the very foundations of wizarding society were beginning to shift beneath them. It started with the parents. Not all families attended the sorting ceremony, but enough were present, proud mothers and fathers who had come to see their children begin their magical education, that the revelations could not be contained within the school's walls. Harry watched as several adults in the gallery section rose from their seats, their faces pale with shock and horror, yet already reaching for communication devices or preparing to leave. Lady Longbottom was the first to act. Neville's formidable grandmother stood with the bearing of a woman who had survived 2 wars and would not stand for a third injustice. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of her position on the Wizengamot and her years of political influence. "This assembly will not disperse until proper authorities have been notified," she declared, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "What we have witnessed tonight constitutes evidence of systematic child abuse, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and gross negligence by one of the most powerful figures in our society. The ministry must be informed immediately." As if summoned by her words, their several parents were already making urgent flu calls from the teaching staff's private hearths, their voices carrying back to the great hall in fragments of horrified conversation. "Immediate investigation required. Child welfare emergency. Dumbledore's complete removal from all positions." The response was faster than Harry had expected. Within minutes of the first calls going out, green flames began erupting from the staff fireplaces as ministry officials arrived via emergency flu protocols. The first to emerge was a woman Harry didn't recognize, tall, imposing, with graying brown hair, and the kind of presence that made everyone in her vicinity stand a little straighter. "Amelia Bones," Professor McGonagall murmured, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." Director Bones surveyed the great hall with sharp, calculating eyes, taking in the scene. Hundreds of students still seated at their house tables, faculty members clustered around the high table in obvious distress, and at the center of it all, a small boy still wearing the sorting hat that had exposed the corruption at the heart of their world. "I am placing this entire assembly under ministry protection," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "No one leaves until statements have been taken. Auras are en route to secure the premises and ensure the integrity of any evidence." As if on cue, more figures began emerging from the staff fireplaces, uniformed auras, ministry officials, and even what appeared to be a team from the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, though Harry couldn't fathom why they would be needed. One of the auras approached Director Bones with a scroll that had clearly just arrived by emergency owl. Her expression grew grimmer as she read it. "The Wizengamot has called an emergency session," she announced. "Chief Warlock Dumbledore's authority is hereby suspended, pending a full investigation into these allegations. All of his positions, Chief Warlock, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, Order of Merlin First Class, are under review." A collective gasp ran through the assembled crowd. For Dumbledore to lose his political positions, this quickly spoke to the severity of the situation and the immediate response of the wizarding government. But it was the arrival of Rita Skeeter that truly marked the moment when the story moved beyond official channels into the realm of public knowledge. The reporter appeared in a flash of green flame, her blonde curls perfectly arranged despite her hasty travel, her quick quotes quill already dancing in the air beside her as she surveyed the scene with predatory satisfaction. "Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet," she announced, though everyone already knew who she was. "I understand there have been some rather shocking revelations about our esteemed former headmaster. The public has a right to know the truth about how their hero has been treating children." For once, Harry found himself grateful for the reporter's aggressive approach to journalism. Whatever her motives, or she would ensure that the story reached every magical household in Britain before morning. Director Bones stepped forward, her expression stern. "This is an ongoing investigation, Miss Skeeter. I trust you'll report responsibly." "Oh, absolutely," Rita replied, though her smile suggested her definition of responsible might differ from the director's. The wizarding public deserves to know exactly how Albus Dumbledore has been manipulating and endangering children while presenting himself as their protector. The sorting hat, which had remained silent during the flurry of official arrivals, spoke again. Its voice seemed to encompass the entire hall, addressing not just those present, but somehow reaching beyond them to the wider magical community that was beginning to learn of the night's revelations. "This is not an isolated incident," the hat declared, and its words seemed to carry the weight of centuries of observation. "What has been done to Harry Potter is part of a pattern that extends throughout wizarding society. How many other children have suffered while adults looked away? How many families have been destroyed by the assumption that authority figures always know best?" As if summoned by the hat's words, owls began arriving in unprecedented numbers, not the usual school post, but emergency communications from across magical Britain, letters from concerned parents, urgent missives from other magical schools, communications from international magical governments expressing shock and demanding explanations. One of the arriving auras handed Director Bones a particularly official-looking scroll. Her face grew pale as she read it. "The International Confederation of Wizards has called for an immediate review of all British child welfare policies," she announced. "Several member nations are expressing concerns about the safety of their exchange students at British magical institutions." The political implications were staggering. Harry could see it in the faces of the officials present. This wasn't just about one man's crimes, but about the credibility of the entire British magical government. How could they have allowed one of their most prominent figures to systematically abuse a child for a decade without oversight? Another owl arrived, this one bearing the seal of St. Mungo's Hospital. Director Bones read the message quickly, then looked up with an expression that might have been relief mixed with additional concern. "St. Mungo's is dispatching a specialized team to conduct medical and psychological evaluations," she announced. They're bringing experts in magical child abuse and trauma recovery." At the high table, Professor McGonagall stepped forward. "Director Bones, I want it on record that the Hogwarts faculty has voted to remove Dumbledore from his position and implement immediate child protection reforms. We will cooperate fully with any investigation." "Noted," Bones replied crisply. "Your cooperation will be essential in understanding how this systematic failure occurred and ensuring it never happens again." Rita Skeeter's quill was working furiously, capturing every word, every official statement, every revelation. Harry could practically see the headlines forming. Dumbledore's decades of deception, the boy who lived and suffered, Hogwarts' hidden shame. More officials were arriving by the minute. Representatives from the Department of International Magical Cooperation, officials from the Committee on Experimental Charms, investigating how the Hat's revelations were possible, even representatives from Gringotts Bank, though Harry couldn't understand why they would be involved. One of the Gringotts representatives approached Director Bones with a scroll that made her expression grow even grimmer. "It appears," she announced after reading, "that there are financial irregularities as well. Questions about the Potter family vault, who has had access, what funds have been used and for what purposes." The scope of Dumbledore's manipulations seemed to expand with every revelation. Not only had he orchestrated Harry's abuse and isolation, but he might have been misappropriating the boy's inheritance as well. A new voice joined the conversation, one Harry recognized from newspaper articles as Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge, though the man looked far less composed than in his official portraits. "This is a disaster," Fudge was saying to Director Bones, clearly unaware that his voice was carrying to much of the hall. "Dumbledore was the cornerstone of public confidence in our government. If it comes out that he's been systematically abusing the boy who lived for political purposes—" "It's already come out," Director Bones replied dryly. "The question now is how we respond. Do we cover it up and lose what credibility we have left, or do we address it head-on and prove that our government can hold even its most powerful figures accountable?" The political calculations were obvious to everyone present. This wasn't just about justice for Harry. It was about the survival of the current magical government and the credibility of wizarding institutions across Britain. More owls arrived, bringing news from across the magical world. Beaubaton Academy in France was launching its own review of child protection policies. Durmstrang Institute was suspending all exchanges with British schools pending investigation. The American magical government was expressing grave concerns about the treatment of magical children in Britain. Even the magical creatures were responding. A delegation of centaurs from the Forbidden Forest had sent word that they would testify about Dumbledore's treatment of magical beings should it become relevant to the investigation. House elves were reportedly sharing stories of being ordered to ignore signs of abuse in magical households. The revolution that had begun in the Great Hall was spreading throughout the entire wizarding world, carried by owls and flu calls and emergency portkeys to every magical community in Europe and beyond. What had started as one child's story was becoming a reckoning with decades of institutional failure and the blind worship of authority figures. Harry watched it all with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and paralyzing fear. The adults were finally taking action, finally holding the powerful accountable, and finally prioritizing child welfare over political convenience. But the scope of what was unfolding was beyond anything he could have imagined when the Sorting Hat first refused to sort him. He was no longer just Harry Potter, the boy who had been abused by his relatives. He had become the catalyst for a fundamental transformation of wizarding society itself. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't facing it alone. Chapter 9. Harry's Voice. The Great Hall had become the center of a storm that was reshaping the wizarding world, but at its heart sat one small boy who had yet to speak for himself. Through all the revelations, all the confessions, all the political maneuvering and official responses, Harry Potter had remained silent. Not by choice, but because silence was what he had been taught was safest. The Sorting Hat's consciousness pressed gently against his own, and Harry could feel the ancient artifact's attention focusing solely on him now, blocking out the chaos surrounding them. When the hat spoke again, its voice was softer than it had been all evening, meant for Harry alone, but somehow carrying to every corner of the hall. "What do you wish to say, child?" The question hung in the air like a gift Harry had never thought to ask for. In 11 years of life, no adult had ever asked him what he wanted to say about his own experiences, his thoughts, his feelings, his perspective. None of it had ever mattered to the people making decisions about his life. Harry opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words were there, had been building inside him for years, but speaking them felt impossible. What if they didn't believe him? What if they decided it was his fault somehow? What if giving voice to his pain made it more real than he could bear? He started, then stopped. Around him, hundreds of people waited in absolute silence. Ministry officials, professors, students, reporters, all of them focused on him with an intensity that made his chest tight with panic. "I don't know what to say." "Say whatever feels true," the hat encouraged gently. "There are no wrong answers here, no expectations you need to meet. This is your moment, Harry. Your voice. Your truth." Harry took a shaky breath, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But in the profound silence of the hall, every word carried clearly. "I was so hungry," he said, and the simple statement seemed to echo off the stone walls. "All the time. Every day. But my stomach would hurt so much that I couldn't sleep, and I'd lie in the cupboard and try to imagine what food tasted like when you could have as much as you wanted." At the Hufflepuff table, several students were already crying. The raw honesty in Harry's voice, the matter-of-fact way he described a child's basic need going unmet, was more devastating than any dramatic revelation. "And I was scared," Harry continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. "Not just of Uncle Vernon when he got angry, but scared all the time. Scared that if I made noise, if I asked for anything, if I existed too loudly, something terrible would happen. So I learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to need nothing." Professor McGonagall had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. At the high table, as Professor Snape was staring at Harry with an expression of recognition that was painful to witness, the look of someone seeing their own childhood trauma reflected in another's words. "But the worst part," Harry said, and now his voice was breaking, "wasn't the hunger or the beatings or sleeping in a cupboard. It was thinking that maybe I deserved it, that maybe there was something wrong with me, something bad, that made it okay for everyone to treat me like that." The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. Director Bones had gone very pale, her professional composure cracking as she listened to a child articulate the psychological damage that systematic abuse could inflict. Harry's hands were trembling now, but he kept speaking. "When Hagrid told me I was famous, that people in your world knew my name, I thought maybe that meant I was worth something after all. That maybe it wasn't my fault that nobody wanted me." His voice grew smaller, more confused. "But then I found out that all these adults knew about me, knew where I was, knew who I was with. And I don't understand." His voice cracked completely. "I don't understand why nobody came, why nobody checked, why nobody thought I might need help." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of muffled sobs from throughout the hall. Students were crying openly now, some reaching across house tables to comfort each other. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to be weeping, their painted faces reflecting the collective grief of adults confronting their failure to protect a child. "Was I worth so little?" Harry asked. And the question was directed at no one and everyone simultaneously. Did everyone just decide that it didn't matter what happened to me, as long as I survived to do whatever Professor Dumbledore needed me to do? At the mention of his name, Dumbledore seemed to shrink further into himself. The man who had orchestrated Harry's suffering couldn't meet the boy's eyes, couldn't face the simple, devastating questions of a child trying to understand why no one had valued him enough to help. Harry wiped his nose with his sleeve, a gesture so achingly normal that it made his previous words even more heartbreaking. "I used to imagine," he said quietly, "that my parents were watching somehow, that maybe they could see what was happening to me. And I'd try so hard to be good, to not cause trouble, because I didn't want them to be disappointed in me, too." The admission broke something in Rita Skeeter, who had been scribbling furiously throughout Harry's testimony. The reporter's famous composure cracked, and she lowered her quill with tears streaming down her face. Even she, apparently, had limits to what she could hear without being affected. "But I think," Harry continued, his voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside, "I think my mum and dad would be disappointed. Not in me. In all of you. They died protecting me. And you, all of you, you just let me be hurt anyway." The accusation hung in the air, simple and devastating in its honesty. A child's straightforward logic cutting through years of adult rationalizations and excuses. "You knew," Harry said, and for the first time, not there was anger in his voice, not the explosive rage of an adult, but the pure, clean fury of a child finally allowed to speak truth to power. "Maybe not all of you knew everything, but you all knew something. You saw signs, you heard rumors, you had suspicions, and you decided it wasn't your problem." He looked around the hall, taking in the faces of students and teachers and officials, all of them frozen by the weight of his words. "You knew," he repeated, his voice growing stronger with each repetition. "And no one came. No one asked if I was okay. No one thought to check if the famous Harry Potter might need help, might be scared, might be hungry, might be just a little boy who wanted someone to care about him." Director Bones stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. "Harry, I want you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. You didn't deserve any of it. And you're right to be angry. We all failed you, and there's no excuse for that." Harry looked at her, this powerful adult who was finally acknowledging his pain without trying to minimize or explain it away. "Why did it take so long?" he asked simply. "Why did I have to sit in front of all these people and have my worst memories shown to everyone before anyone would listen to me?" The question was devastating in its simplicity, and Director Bones had no good answer. None of them did. "Because we were cowards," came a voice from the Gryffindor table. It was the head girl, standing with tears streaming down her face. "Because it was easier to believe that adults always know what they're doing than to question authority. Because we were taught that heroes don't need help, that famous people can't suffer, that if something bad was really happening, surely someone would do something about it." Her words opened floodgates of response throughout the hall. Students and teachers alike began speaking, not offering excuses, but acknowledging their failures, their complicity, their choice to look away when looking might have required them to act. "I'm sorry," came from the Hufflepuff table. "We failed you," from Ravenclaw. "It should never have happened," from Slytherin. "You deserved better," from the faculty table. The apologies washed over Harry like a tide, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. Not as the boy who lived, not as a symbol or a weapon or a convenient solution to adult problems, but as a child who had suffered and survived and deserved to have his voice heard. But it was Neville Longbottom who asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "What do you need now, Harry? How do we make this right?" Harry looked around the hall one more time, taking in the faces of people who were finally listening, finally ready to put his welfare above their own comfort or convenience. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "I need to know that this won't happen to anyone else," he said. "I need to know that other children won't be ignored or abandoned or hurt while adults look the other way." I need to know that my suffering meant something, that it will protect other kids from going through what I did." He paused, wiping his eyes with his sleeve again. "And I need to know that I'm safe now. Really safe. Or not because someone's watching over me and making decisions for me, but because people actually care about what happens to me." The promise, when it came, was spoken by hundreds of voices in unison. Students and teachers and officials all making the same commitment. "We promise." And for the first time in 11 years, Harry Potter believed that adults might actually keep their word. Chapter 10. Dumbledore's Fall. The collective promise that hundreds of voices had made to Harry still echoed in the Great Hall when Dumbledore finally spoke. The man who had orchestrated a child's suffering for 10 years, who had watched the boy he claimed to protect endure systematic abuse in service of his grand design, stepped forward with the bearing of someone making a final stand. "Everything I did," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of authority, "was for the greater good." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, and Harry felt the Sorting Hat's consciousness recoil in disgust. When the ancient artifact responded, its voice was sharp enough to cut diamond. "Whose good, Albus?" the Hat demanded. Certainly not this child's, not the good of a boy who learned to accept starvation as normal, abuse as deserved, isolation as safety. "You speak of the greater good as if it were some noble abstraction, but I see only the specific evil of what you chose to do to one innocent child." Dumbledore's hands trembled as he gripped his wand, the last symbol of the power that was rapidly slipping away from him. The fate of our entire world hung in the balance. Sacrifices had to be made. Sacrifices. Professor McGonagall's voice cut across his words like a blade. "You speak of sacrifice as if you gave up something precious for the cause. But it wasn't your childhood you destroyed, Albus. It wasn't your innocence you shattered. You sacrificed nothing. You simply decided that Harry's suffering was an acceptable cost for your plans." Before Dumbledore could respond, the great doors of the hall burst open with a resounding crash. The Board of Governors of Hogwarts School strode into the chamber, their formal robes billowing behind them as they approached, with the grim determination of officials carrying out an unpleasant but necessary duty. Lord Greengrass, the current chairman of the board, stepped forward with a scroll that bore multiple official seals. His voice, when he spoke, carried the absolute authority of legal mandate. "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore," he announced formally. "By the emergency powers vested in this board, by the Hogwarts Charter, and the authority of the Ministry of Magic, you are hereby removed from your position as headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, effective immediately." The formal pronouncement sent a ripple of shock through the hall, even though everyone present had been expecting it. To hear it stated so officially, so finally, marked the end of an era that had shaped Wizarding Britain for decades. Director Bones stepped forward, flanked by 2 senior Aurors whose presence left no doubt about their intentions. "Albus Dumbledore," she said, her voice crisp with professional authority, "you are under official investigation by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for child endangerment, conspiracy to commit abuse, obstruction of justice, and violation of your duty of care. You will surrender your wand and accompany these Aurors for questioning." But it was the arrival of another official, a witch Harry didn't recognize, but whose presence seemed to command immediate respect, that marked the true scope of Dumbledore's fall from grace. "Madame Marchbanks," Director Bones said with a respectful nod, "head of the Wizarding Examinations Authority and senior member of the Wizengamot." The elderly witch approached Dumbledore with the measured pace of someone delivering a death sentence. In her hands, she carried what appeared to be several ornate certificates and medals, the symbols of the honours and positions that had made Dumbledore the most respected wizard in Britain. "Albus," she said, and her voice carried the weight of decades of friendship turned to bitter disappointment. The Wizengamot has voted unanimously to strip you of your position as Chief Warlock. The International Confederation of Wizards has revoked your title of Supreme Mugwump. Your Order of Merlin, First Class, is hereby rescinded." With each pronouncement, she placed another symbol of his former authority on the table before him. The medals and certificates that had represented a lifetime of achievement and respect were being returned like burial shrouds for a reputation that would never recover. Your membership in the International Association of Quidditch, your honorary doctorate from the Sorbonne Magical University, your fellowship with the Royal Society of Magical Research, all revoked. Madame Marchbank's voice never wavered, though Harry could see tears in her eyes. 50 years of friendship, Albus, and I never suspected you were capable of such calculated cruelty to a child. Dumbledore stood frozen as the symbols of his life's work were stripped away one by one. The man who had been the most powerful wizard in Britain was being reduced to nothing more than a disgraced former educator facing criminal charges. But it was Professor McGonagall who delivered the final blow to his authority within Hogwarts itself. Standing tall with the bearing of someone accepting a burden she had never wanted but would shoulder nonetheless, she addressed the assembled crowd. "I hereby accept the position of interim headmistress of Hogwarts School," she announced, her voice steady despite the tears still visible on her cheeks. "My first act is to implement the child protection protocols that should have been in place decades ago. My second is to ensure that Harry Potter receives the medical care, psychological support, and legal advocacy he should have had from the moment he set foot in our world." The transition of power was complete, marked not by ceremony or tradition, but by the simple reality that authority had passed to someone committed to protecting rather than exploiting the children in her care. But the Sorting Hat was not finished with its revelations. As Dumbledore stood surrounded by the wreckage of his former authority, the ancient artifact spoke again, its voice carrying a weight of centuries. "Shall we speak of the others, Albus?" the Hat asked, and there was something almost gentle in its tone, the gentleness of someone delivering a mercy killing. "Shall we discuss the other children whose welfare you sacrificed for your greater good? The young Tom Riddle, whose obvious signs of psychological disturbance you ignored because addressing them would have interfered with your plans? The werewolf children you refused to advocate for because maintaining the status quo was more convenient?" Each revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Dumbledore hadn't just failed Harry. He had systematically failed vulnerable children for decades, always justifying his inaction with appeals to the greater good or the complexity of the situations. The Muggle-born students whose families you never properly protected, leaving them vulnerable to Death Eater attacks because maintaining plausible deniability was more important than their lives. The half-blood children whose identities you exposed when it served your purposes, condemning them to discrimination and violence. The scope of Dumbledore's failures seemed to expand with every word. This wasn't just about one man's treatment of one child. It was about decades of systematic neglect disguised as wisdom, of convenient blindness presented as strategic thinking. As the weight of these revelations settled over the hall, Dumbledore began moving toward the exit, perhaps hoping to escape the scene of his ultimate humiliation. But as he approached the great doors, something extraordinary happened. To the portraits on the walls, those painted figures of former headmasters and headmistresses who had guided Hogwarts for centuries began moving. Not the usual gentle shifting within their frames, but deliberate, coordinated action. They stepped to the edges of their paintings closest to the doors, forming a barrier that no living person could cross. "You will not leave," declared the portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black, his usually sneering expression replaced by cold determination. "You will face the consequences of your actions. You will answer for every child you failed, every life you destroyed in service of your precious plans. The founders themselves would weep to see what you have done in their name," added the portrait of Armando Dippet. "Hogwarts was built to be a sanctuary for magical children. not a staging ground for psychological manipulation and abuse. Dumbledore turned back to face the hall, trapped between the living people he had betrayed and the painted predecessors whose legacy he had perverted. For the first time since the evening began, he looked truly helpless. No longer the powerful wizard manipulating events from behind the scenes, but simply an old man facing the consequences of his choices. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I am sorry," he said, and the words seemed to echo in the vast space. "I believed I was acting for the best. I believed the sacrifices were necessary." But his apology fell flat, hollow and inadequate in the face of the suffering he had caused. Harry, still sitting beneath the sorting hat, looked at the man who had controlled his life so completely and felt nothing but pity for someone who had traded his humanity for the illusion of control. "Your sorrow changes nothing," Harry said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the silence. "My childhood is still gone. My trust in adults is still broken. The fear you taught me to carry is still there. Your apology doesn't undo any of it." Dumbledore's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his failure settled upon him. The great wizard who had defeated dark lords and shaped the course of wizarding history would be remembered not for his victories, but for the systematic abuse of a child he claimed to protect. As the Aurors stepped forward to escort him from the hall, Dumbledore made one final attempt to justify his actions. "History will vindicate my choices," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. It was the sorting hat that delivered the final judgment. "History," it said with quiet finality, "will remember you as the man who broke a child's spirit for your own convenience. History will remember that when faced with the choice between protecting the innocent and advancing your plans, you chose power over compassion, strategy over humanity. History will remember that you were given the greatest trust our society can bestow, the welfare of our children, and you betrayed that trust so completely that it took a magical artifact to force the truth into the light." As the Aurors led Dumbledore away, his figure seemed to shrink with each step until he disappeared through the great doors, no longer the towering figure of legend, but simply an old man facing the consequences of choices that had seemed so reasonable when he was the only one making them. The age of Albus Dumbledore was over. The age of accountability had begun. Chapter 11. New Foundations. The Great Hall felt different in the aftermath of Dumbledore's removal. The very air seemed lighter, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted from the ancient stones. Harry sat beneath the sorting hat, watching as the immediate transformation of Hogwarts began with Professor McGonagall's first actions as headmistress. "Before we can continue with the sorting," McGonagall announced, her voice carrying the authority of her new position, "we must ensure Harry receives the immediate care he needs." She turned to address the St. Mungo's medical team that had arrived during the chaos. "Please examine Harry thoroughly. I want a complete assessment of his physical and psychological condition, and I want recommendations for immediate intervention." Madame Pumphrey stepped forward, her medical bag in hand, her expression a mixture of professional determination and personal regret. "Harry," she said gently, "may I examine you? I need to document any injuries, assess your nutritional status, and ensure you're not in immediate medical distress." The simple request, asking for his permission rather than demanding compliance, was so foreign to Harry's experience that he almost didn't know how to respond. When had any adult ever asked what he wanted before making decisions about his body, his health, his life? "It's your choice, Harry," McGonagall added, and her words carried a weight that transcended the immediate medical situation. "No one will force you to do anything anymore. Your consent matters. Your voice matters." Harry nodded slowly, still processing the revolutionary concept that his opinion about his own welfare was not only welcome, but required. As Madame Pomfrey began her gentle examination, using diagnostic spells that revealed the full extent of his malnutrition and past injuries, McGonagall continued addressing the hall. "Effective immediately," she declared. "Hogwarts will implement mandatory child protection protocols. Every member of staff will be trained to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. We will establish anonymous reporting systems that cannot be overridden by any single administrator. Student welfare will be overseen by an independent committee that includes student representatives." At the house tables, students were listening with rapt attention. These weren't empty promises or bureaucratic platitudes. These were specific, actionable changes being implemented in real time. "We will also institute regular welfare checks for all students," McGonagall continued. "Not invasive interrogations, but genuine check-ins to ensure every child feels safe, supported and heard. No student will suffer in silence, while adults choose comfortable ignorance." Professor Sprout stood up from the high table. "I volunteer to coordinate the Family Placement Review Committee," she announced. "Every student currently living in questionable home situations will be reassessed, with their safety as the primary concern, not family tradition or social expectations." The commitment to immediate action was spreading throughout the faculty. Professor Flitwick volunteered to establish peer counseling programs, while Professor McGonagall herself would personally oversee the implementation of student advocacy systems. But it was the Sorting Hat's gentle voice in Harry's mind that brought his attention back to his own immediate situation. "Are you ready, Harry?" the Hat asked softly. "Ready to choose where you belong, now that you truly have a choice?" The question was more profound than it appeared. For the first time in his life, Harry was being offered genuine agency in a decision that would affect his future. Not manipulation disguised as choice, not false options designed to lead him to predetermined outcomes, but real, an authentic choice, backed by adults, committed to supporting whatever he decided. Harry thought about the houses he had learned about from Hagrid and the other students. Gryffindor, known for bravery and chivalry, but also for the kind of reckless heroics that had defined too much of his short life already. Ravenclaw, valuing intelligence and learning, offering the quiet pursuit of knowledge he had never been allowed to explore. Hufflepuff, emphasizing loyalty and hard work, qualities that resonated with someone who had learned to value genuine kindness above flashy displays. Slytherin, prizing ambition and cunning, traits he had developed in order to survive. "What do you think?" Harry asked the Hat quietly, surprising himself with the question. "Where do I belong?" The Hat's consciousness wrapped around his own with something that felt like warm affection. "You could excel in any house, Harry Potter. You have been forced to develop all the qualities our founders valued. The question is not where you could succeed, but where you want to grow." Harry closed his eyes, thinking not about what others expected of him, or what would serve some greater strategic purpose, but about what he actually wanted for himself. What kind of person did he want to become, now that he was free to choose? "I want to learn how to be brave without being reckless," he said finally. "I want to find courage that protects others instead of just surviving. I want to be in Gryffindor, but not because everyone expects it, because I choose it." The Hat's approval was warm and immediate. "Or Gryffindor it is," it declared aloud. And this time the word carried none of the predetermined certainty it might have had hours earlier. This was a choice made freely, with full knowledge and genuine agency. The great hall erupted in applause, but it sounded different than the perfunctory clapping that usually greeted sorting announcements. This was celebration of something more meaningful, a child finally being given the choice to determine his own path. As Harry rose from the stool and approached the Gryffindor table, he was greeted not with the hero worship he had feared, but with genuine welcome from students who had witnessed his courage in speaking truth to power. Ron Weasley, whose family loyalty had warred with horror at the revelations, they offered Harry a space beside him, with a shy smile that held no expectation beyond friendship. Hermione Granger, whose analytical mind had processed every ethical violation of the evening, leaned forward with tears still visible on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I'm sorry that adults failed you so badly, and I promise, we all promise, that you'll never face anything alone again." The commitment was echoed throughout the Gryffindor table, but Harry could see similar pledges being made at every house table. Students who had learned hard lessons about authority and accountability were making their own vows to protect and support each other. As the medical examination concluded, Madame Pomfrey approached McGonagall with a scroll detailing her findings. Her expression was grim but determined. "Severe malnutrition affecting growth and development," she reported quietly, though her words carried to nearby students. "Evidence of multiple healed fractures, some improperly set. Significant psychological trauma requiring specialized intervention. But," she added with professional optimism, "nothing that cannot be treated with proper care and time." McGonagall nodded gravely. "What do you need?" "Immediate nutritional rehabilitation, regular psychological counseling with a specialist in childhood trauma, and most importantly, a stable, supportive environment where he can begin to heal." Pomfrey looked directly at Harry. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but you can recover from this. You can learn to trust, to feel safe, to value yourself as you deserve to be valued." For the first time since the evening began, Harry felt hope, not the desperate, fragile hope of a child clinging to fantasies of rescue, but the solid, grounded hope of someone surrounded by adults committed to his actual welfare. But the evening's revelations had opened floodgates beyond just Harry's story. As the immediate crisis passed and students began to process what they had witnessed, others started coming forward with their own experiences. A fifth-year Hufflepuff approached Professor Sprout hesitantly. "Professor," she said quietly, I think my family situation might need to be reviewed too." A Ravenclaw second year raised his hand tentatively. "My stepfather, he's never hurt me badly, but sometimes." One by one, students began sharing their own stories of questionable home situations, of adults who made them uncomfortable, but of warning signs they had been taught to ignore or normalize. The culture of silence that had protected abusers for generations was cracking open, replaced by an environment where children felt safe to speak truth about their experiences. Professor McGonagall listened to each confession with the gravity it deserved, making notes, asking gentle questions, ensuring that every child who found the courage to speak would be heard and protected. "This is what healing looks like," the Sorting Hat observed quietly, its words carrying to Harry alone. "Not just your individual recovery, but the beginning of a cultural transformation that will protect countless other children. Or your courage in speaking your truth has given others permission to speak theirs." As the evening finally began to wind down, though it would be hours before the last statements were taken and the last reforms outlined, Harry found himself surrounded by genuine support for the first time in his life. Not the manipulative pseudo-care designed to make him useful, but authentic concern for his well-being from people who asked for nothing in return. Ron, who had shared his own family's horror at learning how they had unknowingly failed to protect Harry during his visit to Diagon Alley, was quietly describing life at the Burrow, not trying to fix Harry's trauma, but simply letting him know what normal family life could look like. Hermione was already researching magical treatments for childhood trauma, her naturally helpful nature channeled toward actually helpful ends rather than empty gestures. Neville, who understood better than most what it meant to live with the weight of adults' expectations, simply sat nearby, offering the quiet companionship of someone who didn't need words to communicate understanding. Even students from other houses were approaching, not seeking friendship with the famous Harry Potter, but offering support to a fellow child who had survived something no child should endure. As the last of the official business was concluded and students finally began making their way to their dormitories, Harry realized that this was what safety felt like. not the false security of being controlled and manipulated for his supposed protection, but the genuine safety of being surrounded by people committed to his actual welfare, who respected his choices and valued his voice. The Sorting Hat, finally removed from his head after hours of revelations, offered one final piece of wisdom as Madame Pomfrey escorted Harry toward the hospital wing for a proper night's rest. "Remember," the Hat said, its voice growing fainter as distance increased between them. "Healing is not forgetting what was done to you. It is learning that what was done to you does not define your worth, your future, or your capacity to trust again. The adults who failed you were wrong, about your value, about what you deserved, about what was necessary or acceptable. You matter, Harry Potter. You have always mattered." As Harry finally settled into a proper bed with clean sheets and the promise of regular meals, and surrounded by adults whose primary concern was his well-being rather than his utility, he felt something he had never experienced before: the certainty that tomorrow would be better than today, and that he would never again have to face his struggles alone. The foundations of a new life were being laid, built not on manipulation and control, but on respect, choice, and the revolutionary idea that children deserved to be protected simply because they were children. For the first time in 11 years, Harry Potter fell asleep, feeling truly safe. Chapter 12. The Boy Who Lived Protected. 3 days had passed since the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry Potter, and Hogwarts had transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. As Harry made his way through the corridors toward his first official charms lesson, now he marveled at how different everything felt when you knew the adults around you were actually committed to your welfare. The changes were everywhere. Posted prominently in every common room and corridor were new notices outlining student rights and reporting procedures. Faculty members wore small pins indicating their availability as student advocates. Most importantly, there was a fundamental shift in the atmosphere, a sense that children's voices mattered, that their safety was paramount, and that no authority figure was beyond questioning. Harry's first night in Gryffindor Tower had been a revelation. Instead of the hero worship he had feared, or the awkward distance he might have expected, his housemates had welcomed him with a mixture of protective care and genuine curiosity about him as a person rather than as a symbol. Or they understood, in the way that children often do, that he needed normal friendship more than grand gestures. Percy Weasley, the fifth-year prefect, had personally ensured that Harry understood every aspect of the new student protection protocols. If anyone at all, student or staff, makes you uncomfortable or pressures you to do anything you don't want to do, you report it immediately, Percy had said, with the earnestness that characterized everything he did. No exceptions, no matter who they are or what authority they claim. The promise was echoed by the other prefects and older students, creating a network of protection that felt genuine rather than suffocating. They weren't trying to control Harry's choices. They were ensuring he always had choices to make. Professor McGonagall had been true to her word about personal commitment to his well-being. She checked on him daily, not with the invasive monitoring that had characterized Dumbledore's approach, but with the natural concern of an adult who had learned to prioritize a child's actual needs over institutional convenience. "How are you settling in, Potter?" she asked, as she encountered him on his way to class. But the question wasn't perfunctory. She waited for a real answer, listened to his concerns, and acted on anything that needed addressing. "Better than I expected," Harry answered honestly. It was still strange, being able to give truthful responses about his well-being without fear of consequences. "The nightmares are getting a bit better, and Madame Pomfrey says the nutrition potions are helping." McGonagall nodded approvingly. "Doctor, clear water from St. Mungo's will be here this afternoon for your weekly session. And remember, if you need to speak with someone between appointments, any of the faculty can arrange emergency support." The establishment of proper psychological care had been one of McGonagall's first priorities, but it was far from her most ambitious reform. The announcement that had appeared in the Daily Prophet that morning had sent shockwaves through the wizarding world. The creation of the Potter Protection Foundation, funded by a portion of Harry's own vault and managed by a board that included both Harry himself and other survivors of childhood trauma. "It's not just about the money," Hermione had explained excitedly at breakfast, waving the newspaper article. "It's about creating systematic change. The foundation will fund research into magical trauma recovery, provide legal advocacy for abused children, and establish emergency housing for kids who need to be removed from dangerous situations immediately." Ron, who was still processing his family's horror at how they had unknowingly failed to recognize the signs of Harry's abuse, looked up from his porridge. "Mum wrote to say she's volunteering with the Emergency Family Placement Program. She wants to make sure no kid goes through what you did, because there wasn't anywhere safe for them to go." The knowledge that his suffering was being transformed into protection for others was perhaps the most healing thing Harry had experienced. His pain had meaning now, purpose beyond just surviving it. Other children would be safer, because he had found the courage to speak his truth. But it was the smaller, more personal changes that Harry treasured most. The way Neville had quietly shared his own experiences with family pressure and unrealistic expectations, creating a bond based on mutual understanding rather than shared trauma. The way Hermione included him in her study groups, not because he was famous, but because she genuinely enjoyed his questions and perspectives. The way Ron defended him from students who still approached with misplaced hero worship, redirecting conversations toward normal topics like Quidditch and homework. As Harry entered the Charms classroom, Professor Flitwick greeted him with the same warm professionalism he showed every student. No special treatment, no careful handling, just the respect due to any child beginning their magical education. It was exactly what Harry needed. "And today we'll be learning the basic levitation charm," Professor Flitwick announced, and Harry felt a thrill of genuine excitement. Magic lessons without hidden agendas, without tests of worthiness, without the weight of destiny hanging over every spell, just the joy of learning something new and wonderful. As the lesson progressed, Harry found himself relaxing in a way he never had before. When his feather stubbornly refused to levitate properly, it was simply a normal learning challenge, not evidence of personal failure. When Hermione's feather soared gracefully upward, it was cause for shared celebration, not competitive anxiety. When Ron's feather caught fire, somehow it was just funny, not a source of shame or fear. This was what childhood should feel like, full of wonder and discovery, supported by adults who wanted nothing more than to see you learn and grow. After class, as students filtered out into the corridor, Harry was surprised to hear a familiar voice in his mind. The Sorting Hat, he realized, was speaking to him from its resting place in McGonagall's office, its consciousness reaching out across the castle. "How are you finding your new life, Harry Potter?" the Hat asked gently. "Strange," Harry answered honestly, knowing the Hat would understand the complexity behind the simple word. "Good strange, mostly. But I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to decide I don't deserve this, after all." "That wariness will fade with time," the Hat assured him. "Trust, once broken so thoroughly, takes patience to rebuild. But you are surrounded by people committed to proving themselves trustworthy through their actions, not just their words." As if summoned by their conversation, Professor McGonagall appeared in the corridor, and Harry could sense the Hat's attention turning to her. "The new student screening protocols are working well," she reported, though Harry realized she was speaking for his benefit as much as the Hat's. "We've identified 3 more students whose home situations require intervention, and the emergency placement network has already found them safe, loving families." The Hat's satisfaction was palpable. "And the broader reforms?" "The Ministry has adopted our protection protocols as the new standard for all magical schools," McGonagall continued. "Beauxbaton and Durmstrang are implementing similar changes, and the International Confederation of Wizards is developing universal standards for child welfare in magical communities." Harry felt a sense of awe at the scope of change that had rippled out from that night in the Great Hall. One child finding the courage to speak had transformed not just his own life, but the entire wizarding world's approach to protecting its most vulnerable members. "And what of you, Harry?" McGonagall asked, turning her attention to him directly. "Do you feel safe here? Protected? Heard?" The questions weren't rhetorical. She genuinely wanted his assessment, his feedback on whether the changes were meeting his actual needs, rather than just satisfying adult assumptions about what he might need. "I do," Harry said, and he was surprised to realize it was completely true. "For the first time in my life, I feel like the adults around me actually want what's best for me, not what's best for their plans or their comfort." McGonagall's smile was soft with genuine affection. "That will never change, Harry. Your voice will always be heard and believed here. Your welfare will always be our priority, not because of who you are or what you might do for us, but simply because you are a child who deserves protection and care." As the professor continued on her rounds and Harry made his way toward his next class, the Sorting Hat offered one final observation. "You have taught them all something invaluable," the Hat said, "that true strength lies not in the willingness to sacrifice others for noble goals, but in the commitment to protect the innocent regardless of the cost to oneself. They are better people now because you had the courage to speak your truth." "Will other kids be safer because of what happened?" Harry asked, because that was what mattered most to him. "Infinitely safer," the Hat assured him. "The culture of blind obedience to authority has been shattered. The assumption that powerful figures always act in children's best interests has been exposed as the dangerous myth it always was. Most importantly, children's voices are now valued and protected in ways they never were before." As Harry settled into his next class, Defense Against the Dark Arts, now being taught by a competent instructor who had been thoroughly vetted by the new Oversight Committee, he reflected on how much had changed. The nightmares were fading. The constant hypervigilance was slowly relaxing. Of the desperate need to please authority figures was being replaced by a healthy understanding of his own worth and rights. He was learning to trust again, carefully and gradually, but with the support of people who had earned that trust through consistent actions rather than demanding it through authority or manipulation. Most importantly, he was learning to value himself, not as the boy who lived, not as a weapon to be wielded or a symbol to be displayed, but as Harry Potter, an 11-year-old boy who deserved love and protection and the chance to discover who he wanted to become. As the day ended and Harry made his way back to Gryffindor Tower, surrounded by friends who knew his story and valued him anyway, he realized that this was what safety felt like. Not the absence of all challenges or difficulties, but the presence of people committed to facing those challenges alongside him. The boy who had lived was finally, truly protected, and in that protection he was beginning to learn how to live. Not just survive, but actually live, for the first time in his 11 years. The Sorting Hat had been right. His voice had changed everything, and it would continue to matter, continue to be heard, continue to protect not just himself, but countless other children who deserved better than the failures of the past. Harry Potter was safe, and because he was safe, the wizarding world was beginning to become the place it had always claimed to be, a community that truly protected its most vulnerable members. The revolution was complete. The healing had begun. And for the first time since his parents died, Harry was exactly where he belonged, in a place that valued him not for what he could do for others, but for who he was in his own right. The boy who lived had finally learned how to live, and in learning that lesson, he had taught an entire world how to love its children properly. What if Petunia Dursley left Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep at age 3, and Molly raised him as her 8th child? What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner to go back to the night Harry's parents died, and found Dumbledore already there, watching what if Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts at age 60 and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control? What if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys on the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back? What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive and found dark magic that should never have been nearer? Child, what if Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before? Harry, what if Severus Snape took Harry the night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul? What if Victor Krum offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school at age 12 and Snape was the one who held the door open? What if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits came alive during Harry's trial and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother Augusta demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13 after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry filed the day after Lily and James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine Auror check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys to the Ministry? What if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, and every entry was about Dumbledore's demands? What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury? Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot. What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance in third year to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip? What if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free until Dumbledore came looking for him at age 14? What if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore, and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the third task, and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the Room of Requirement for 5 years before Hogwarts? What if Winky, the house elf, testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch, Sr., knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along?